Thank you, and good evening. Tonight is the third in our lecture series for the Indigenous Research Institute. The Indigenous Research Institute was created on the campus of Simon Fraser University to be a central point for a dialogue between the different researchers who were working on Aboriginal issues at SFU. We have recently learned that there are a lot of people who were working on Indigenous issues at Simon Fraser University, but due to the tendency for people to work within their own silos, there's a very little bit of cross dialogue or cross-pollination with our various researchers. So this speaker series is intended to bring together people who have common interests and to be able to share them in a venue that hopefully brings dialogue to the community and to enlighten people about the types of research that is taking place at SFU. So tonight we're very delighted to have Dr. Anke Kessler, and without further ado, I'll call her up.
Thank you, Alden, and sorry, I forgot your name, for the kind introduction. And also thanks everybody for coming. I didn't realize, in fact, until I came right down here, that it is a Connects game tonight. And so I need to speak into the microphone. Thank you very much. What I'll do is I'll start out by giving you a little bit of a context to the First Nation Property Ownership Act, and also tell you about what made me first interested in the topic and what motivated the research that I will be presenting today. In a nutshell, the First Nations Property Ownership Act, is this working? So in a nutshell, the First Nation Property Ownership Act is meant to improve economic development on First Nations reserves, and by doing so, helping First Nations lift themselves out of poverty by their own bootstraps, so to speak. How bad is the situation on First Nations reserves? Well, it's actually pretty bad, and I have a slide for this. If you think about the situation in terms of economic indicators, the vast majority of economic indicators are going to give you very bad outcomes for First Nations. So in particular, what we're having here, what we were seeing is, regardless of what kind of indicator you're using and what kind of indices, there's always going to be the First Nations are always going to be at the very bottom of the distribution, whether that's the health indicators such as suicide or let's say access to flowing water, whether that is, sorry, I'm trying to pull up the slides here, but it doesn't work. More technical issues. Okay, sorry. Do you mind if you pull up my slides here so I can see my slides rather than looking at the screen below? I can't? Okay, then in this case, sorry. I'm going to have to.
Use this, or do you want to stand by the podium?
No, I'm going to take a look at the answer. I'm going to stand by the podium and use this. Sorry. Okay. Lots of technical issues, but we're going to get through those. Okay, so in terms of every indicator you can possibly imagine, Aboriginal communities are at the bottom of the distribution. Health, income, education, you name it. Half of all First Nations children are living below the poverty line. And the Department of the Federal Ministry that is in charge of the First Nations in Canada, the ministry is called Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada, computes a well-being index, CWB. This index is a composite index of various measures of health, well-being, housing quality, etc., and reserves. And according to that index, over 40% of bands score lower on that index in First Nations communities than the worst of the non-Aboriginal communities. That means not only are we looking at bands at the bottom of the distribution in terms of well-being, but we're also seeing the distribution shifted completely to the left. Okay? Perhaps the most discouraging fact of all, if I could, okay, sorry, it's not working. The clicker. I'm just gonna press a button here. No. Nope. Tell me which button to press on the, and I'm just gonna. Okay, so what did I do wrong? Oh, we need to stay here. Is that what you're telling me? Okay. He tells me I need to stay at the podium, which is exactly what I'm going to do now. No, seriously, I'm not venturing it forth anymore. Okay, let's see. All right. So we're going to overcome the birth troubles of this talk. Okay. So let's focus on the picture that I have here. What the picture shows is that not only is the situation bad, the situation also doesn't improve very much. The community, on the vertical axis, is the Community Wellbeing Index that is computed by the Ministry, Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada. On the horizontal axis is the time. And what you see is the dark blue line, which is the non-Aboriginal communities in Canada, are far above the community well-being indices of the red line, which is the Aboriginal communities. But not only that, the time trend is such that the communities in general are growing. You know, children are doing better than their parents. However, this time trend has not been steady for the Aboriginal communities. If you look at particularly the last decade, the 2001, so in the first decade of the 21st century, what you see for Aboriginal communities is the line is stagnating, and in fact, it's not just stagnating, it's actually decreasing slightly. And so the gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities is actually, at the moment, growing. Even though we are in a land, we are in a nation where prosperity is increasing over time, the Aboriginal communities are falling behind and the gap is growing. And so this is the context in which the First Nations Property Ownership Act was proposed. And the reason it was, so people thought about land management as one of the key factors in determining economic prosperity was that, and I'm quoting here from the 2014 report of the Standing Committee of Aboriginal Affairs, which is a parliamentary committee. The reason that people thought that land management was crucial is that the current system of Aboriginal land management that is done under the Indian Act for most bands has a lot of issues. It comes with a lot of issues. Those issues are all rooted in the fact that it is that the reserve land is managed by the Crown. It is the ministry with that tongue-twisting name that is managing and administering all reserve land. And what this means for the individual bands is that they have to go through the ministry whenever they as a band or individual members of the band want to do any transactions on the land. Common activities such as registering the land or leasing the land are burdened with red tape, and they're very onerous restrictions imposed on those activities. Another issue that people have been pointed out is that band members cannot use, because of the land tenure system that has the land title vested in the Crown, and has the land set aside for the exclusive usage of bands, land that is under this land management regime, that is reserve land, cannot be transferred to third parties outside the band, which essentially means that you cannot mortgage or collateralize the land that you potentially own to take out a loan for investment purposes or economic development. And that's another sort of problem that people have pointed out to, and I'm going to come back to that problem in the lecture a couple of times. Last but not least, the land is centrally administered by the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada, which means it's centrally administered. So there's this one-size-fits-all approach in which bands are unable to adjust the codes and the bylaws that are governing their land, but instead have to abide for whatever the ministry sees fit, which is, of course, something that fits every band, that applies to every band with no exceptions. So there's a multitude of issues, and there's no denying that these issues exist. And as I said, there's been a multitudes of reports been written on the problem, and people have suggested various solutions, including, and this brings me to the First Nations Property Ownership Act, including the privatization of land. Okay. The First Nation Property Ownership Act is a piece of legislation that was proposed in 2012, essentially. The initiative has been going on a little bit longer, but sort of it became very prominent in 2012. It would amend the Indian Act, so it would amend the land statutes under the Indian Act as they pertain to First Nations land management, and it would allow essentially each First Nation to acquire its entire reserve land area in fee simple ownership. This also means it would be allowed to have jurisdiction over the land and administer its own land codes. In addition, the First Nation can then go ahead and grant individual titles of this land to individual members. So giving a particular plot of land to an individual band member would now be possible in fee simple. Right? It is even on the existing code possible, and I'm going to talk about this at length later, but under the new act, it would be possible to have a fee simple ownership just like you and I have on our house. And that fee simple ownership would allow transfer by definition, not only among band members, but also between band members and the outside world. So the big idea behind the act is to eliminate red tape, of course, but also to establish this large and open outside market to which bands would then have access, and so enable individuals and bands, but mostly individuals, to collateralize, to use that debt capital that's embedded in their land and for economic development and for investment purposes. Okay. This last idea, which is that individual ownership of land is key to prosperity because it allows individuals to unlock the capital that's embedded in the land that they use, and which then allows them to use that capital that's sort of unlocked now and use it for investment and for economic development. This idea can be attributed to Hernando de Soto. Hernando de Soto is not the South American conquistador and explorer, but rather he is a Peruvian economist who wrote a very influential book in 2000, which was called The Mystery of Capital. What he does in the book is essentially promote the idea I was just talking about, that individual ownership of land can generate great economic prosperity. And he asserts in the book that the key impediment to economic development in the third world, in developing countries, is in fact individual ownership of land, or the lack thereof, rather. What this means is that if you ask Fernando de Soto, why are some nations poor and why are other nations rich, de Soto would say, well, that's because the poor nations don't allow enough individual ownership of land. Okay. You can tell I'm not a fan of Fernando de Soto. The book has been so influential because it propagates a very simple answer to a very, very complex question. Okay. That fact notwithstanding, the proponents of the First Nation Property Ownership Act have used de Soto's arguments extensively to motivate this idea of private property of First Nations land being able to bring about large changes, large sort of jumps in economic development. However, not everybody was happy with the act. In fact, there was quite a bit of controversy when the act was first proposed. One part of the problem with the First Nations Property Ownership Act that people were seeing was that people were taking issue, First Nations in particular, with the notion that our main goal should be the individualized pursuit of wealth. And they also took issue with the fact that by focusing on the conceptualization of land, the Western conceptualization of land as a financial asset, what people were disregarding was that for most First Nations, land, their traditional territories, and their ancestral lands represent an integral part of their social, political, and cultural identity. And so you cannot really see land as a financial asset, or you shouldn't be seeing land as exclusively as a financial asset, which is a sort of a Western tradition of seeing land. So that was one, sort of big issue that people took with the act. But there were others that are less, that are maybe more tangible. For instance, people pointed to the resemblance of the First Nation Property Ownership Act with the Dawes Act, which was enacted in 1887 in the US, and which essentially mandated private property of US reserves, and which led to a huge loss of land in the United States. Millions of hectares of land was lost in the wake of the Dawes Act because people were selling out the land, and that land could not be recovered later. So the fear here was, I should be moving forward. The fear here was that really the First Nation Property Ownership Act was sort of an effort to assimilate First Nations in disguise, and would lead to a substantial loss of land and to loss of constitutional and treaty rights for the First Nations. And then last but not least, there was the notion that we already have a number of possible individual ownership regimes of land on reserve, and that these regimes should suffice for people who wish to pursue economic development to do this under the existing Indian Act regime. Why is it going back and forth? I'm not pressing. Anyways, so what is our research here? Well, we look at existing forms of land tenure on reserve, and we're going to ask essentially two questions. One is, to which extent do First Nations make use of the individual this individual land tenure system? And the second is, what can we say about what the effect of this land tenure of individual property as it currently exists on reserve, and I'm going to explain this in a moment and what exactly that is. What is the effect of that property on measurable outcomes? Can we say anything about this? Okay. So the first set of statistics that I'm going to tell you about is the result of work I did with Marina Brinkhorst, who was a master's student at SFU. This was published in 2014 in the Journal of Aboriginal Economic Development. I should also say that the second set of results has not been published yet, so it's really research on the go, and you're getting a real-time glance at what we're doing in the Statistics Center right now. which is also partly why I cannot give you all the results, because the results do use confidential microdata files, which take weeks to get out of the secure data center. So I am unfortunately not able to show you everything we have right now. Okay, but now back to what we do have. Taking stock, what you see is there's about 3,000 reserves currently on Canadian soil, and those reserves cover a total of about 3.5 million hectares of land. There's three types of land management that are being in use. One is the land management under the Indian Act, and now I do have to walk around. I kind of feel. Let me see whether this is. Hello? Okay. So one is the land management under the Indian Act tenure system, and then the two others, which is the First Nations Land Management Act and self-government treaties, are land management regimes that allow First Nation band to opt out of the Indian Act tenure system. But what you can see if you look at the numbers is that the vast majority of both bands and the vast majority of the land is actually covered by the Indian Act. It's approximately 3.4 million hectares, which is about 97% of the land. So we're really talking about mostly Indian Act land. What is Indian Act land? Well, it's land that is, the title of which is invested in the Crown, and land which is primarily community held. So there's a communal nature to the land, but individual forms of land tenure exist. What are those forms? There's three of those. One is customary land holdings. Customary land holdings occur when the band council gives an individual band member or allots an individual band member a piece of land. This kind of land, this is the most common form, the customary land holdings, but they do lack legal protection. So it means that, you know, in principle, the band council could any day decide to allot the piece of land to somebody else. The second type of individual land tenure on First Nations reserve under the Indian Act are the CPs, or certificates of possession. The certificates of possession are the ones, these are going to be the things that I'm going to study most. Why? Because they do resemble fee simple ownership. And I'm going to talk about what exactly they are on the next slide. The third individual land tenure system is the leasehold interest. They can be of two forms. One is band lease. So bands can set aside communal land, designate it for economic development, and then lease it out to third parties. And one is individual lease. People that have CPs can use those CPs and lease it to third parties. It's not very common to have individual lease. The majority of these leasehold interests is band lease, however. Okay. But let's get back to the certificates of possession, which is what I really want to talk about. So certificates of possession, those have been introduced in 1951. What they do is they grant a permanent title to a piece of land, almost in the way that fee simple does. It's very close to fee simple, not only because it's permanent, but also because it's enforceable by the court. So it cannot be taken, cannot be expropriated easily when you own a CP. You can transfer it to other band members, you can bequest it, and you can sell it. You can also use it as a collateral in band-backed mortgages. So it is possible with CPs to collateralize the land that you own or that you are entitled to, given the CP that you have. What are the main differences? Well, the first is that all transactions that you're doing do require ministerial approval. So I mentioned the red tape. There it is. Individual, if you have a CP and you want to sell it or you want to lease it, you have to have a ministerial approval, which can, take some time. So there's red tape. The second and perhaps more important difference is that CPs are not transferable to non-band members. Remember, the land on reserves is vested in the Crown. It's set aside for the exclusive usage of Indian bands, which means nobody else can acquire it. So the market that is the quote market that is part of can be used for the CPs is a smaller market than the market that would be present if you had fee simple ownership. But other than that, they're basically the same thing. Okay? And so what I'm going to do later on at the end of the talk is use that kind of CP system to think about what a privatization would do. So use the CP measure as a proxy for what individual land tenure in fee simple would look like and what kind of effects it would have. However, but before we get to those results, let me present these statistics that I've been gathering with Marina in the 2004 research. And what this shows here is the distribution of CPs at a time, this is sort of a time snapshot in 2006 across bands. On the vertical axis, you see the percentage share of band land that is currently under CP. And there's two groups of bands, essentially. Now, let me see whether I can manage this. Right, perfect. So the first group of bands, which are 288, do not use CPs at all. Right? This is a very sort of astonishing finding, given the idea that individual land ownership supposedly brings about prosperity. There doesn't seem to be a lot of demand for that individual ownership. Of course, we cannot really, the data don't tell us whether what we're seeing here is the reluctance of band councils to grant CPs, or whether we're just seeing the lack of interest in CPs from individual holders. But whatever it is that generates the data, the fact remains that there's 50% of bands who don't have any land under CP at all, even though CP is the closest that you can get to individual ownership. So there doesn't seem to be, either at the band level or individual level, a lot of demand for this kind of individual land tenure. Now, among the bands that do have CP land, what you see here, remember the vertical axis is the share of land under CP, is the 10th, these are, the bars are percentiles. So this tiny one is the 10th percentile, 25th percentile, and then this medium blue is the 50th percentile, which is also the median. And what this tells us, the median, the height of this bar is 4.8, implying that the median band has less than 5% of land under lawful possession among those that actually use the measure. So you could think of some bands actually wanting to use the measure, but even those that do, the 50% of them are having less than 5% of their land under lawful possession. So it's only at the very tippy top, so this is the 10th top percentile, so the top 10% of bands using CPs, that you see a significant amount of band land under CP, which in this case is about 40%. Okay? So the first sort of conclusion from this kind of research, we did a few more things, as I'll see in a second, is that the uptake of CP is very little. And it's not clear, at least from the numbers, why that is, especially given the argument that we've been seeing before of De Soto and others, that this kind of individualized land tenure should be in high demand, because it's keeping people from developing their economic potential. This map geocodes the extents of the usage of CPs. Remember, CPs are the certificates of possession that are individual, that are allocated to individuals on band land. And what the dark points represent, each point is a band, right? And what the dark points represent are those bands that actually use it to the extent of having more than 5% of their land under CP. And what you see is something that you might have guessed already, but this map certainly confirms it. First of all, yes, there is a lot of white dots. The white dots mean all these bands do not use CP at all. And second, the dark dots, those bands that do use CP, they all tend to gather around urban centers. If you visualize this, visualize the Lower Mainland, you look at Calgary, you look at Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, those urban centers, proximity to urban centers seems to be something that inspires bands to use CPs. So of course that was, I didn't actually mean to say it inspires bands. This was, what I meant to say was it's correlated, it's highly correlated. Right? For whatever reason, if you're close to an urban center, you're looking at more CP usage than if you are far up north or if you are in the prairies. This represents a challenge to a researcher who's thinking about the connection between the usage of individual land tenure and prosperity in the following sense. Okay? The main problem that we're having when we're thinking about, well, let me backtrack for a second. So first of all, let me recall what the theory says. The theory says that we should be seeing, if we follow De Soto and his arguments, the theory says we should be seeing a connection, a causal relationship between the uptake of individual land tenure and economic development, using this idea of unlocking your capital that is embedded in the land and then, walking off and doing something productive with it. But there's a couple of caveats to this argument, both theoretical and, as we will see, empirical. On the theoretical side, there's actually, if you think about the argument it just made, which is the Soto argument, there's actually sort of very little reason to expect that this kind of unlocking of capital is something that will significantly impact the First Nations reserves as they are right now in Canada. When De Soto made his original argument, he was thinking about a situation in South America where there were mostly urban squatters. Those squatters do not have access to individual ownership of land, so they're squatting on their, they're building their huts and their little houses on land that is not theirs. As a result, they often can't get electricity to that land, they can't get water to the land, they live in constant fear of being evicted, and yes, they cannot collateralize the land to use the land as a backing up loan, which then would enable them to become small-scale entrepreneurs. Small-scale entrepreneurship in developing countries is very important because other than day laborer, there's very little ways to make your money in these places. And so what people could do with the capital that has been unlocked in their title, once they got a title, would be to buy a bunch of chickens and sell the eggs, or buy a little motorcycle and start a taxi service and things like that. And in the developing world, in the context that De Soto was operating, this makes quite a bit of sense, but it doesn't make that much sense in the First Nations communities as we see them right now in Canada. It's very sort of hard to envision all the First Nations becoming small-scale entrepreneurs on reserve land if only they had enough capital to do so. So that's sort of the theoretical connection between what De Soto was envisioning and what's actually the reality on Canadian reserves is sort of fuzzy. Let me put it this way. There's also some empirical issues with the data. One is, how do we measure CP? And the other one, we have to be really careful to compare apples with apples. What do I mean by the latter? Well, a good sort of study in how not to do this, and a good example of how not to do this is a recent study by Tom Flanagan, who in 2013 published a Fraser Institute, together with a co-author, published a Fraser Institute report in which he did just that. He measured certificates of possession as a proxy of the extent of private land holdings on reserve, and then related those to economic prosperity as measured by the Community Well-Being Index. So the way to look at this picture or this graph is on the horizontal axis is the density of CPs, and on the vertical axis is community well-being. Each dot represents one band, and as you can see that many bands are not using CPs at all. This is the bunched black mass here on the 0. But then as you move from 0 towards a more extensive usage of these certificates of possession, you can kind of see that individual well-being, community well-being sort of increases. Meaning that bands who are using certificates of possession more are also experiencing higher levels of community well-being. Okay? And this line that is drawn in the middle of the picture is just a way to illustrate this positive relationship through what's called a multivariate regression analysis and the regression line. Sort of what it's trying to do is capture this cloud of data in a linear way, and to posit a linear relationship between using certificates of possession and economic well-being. And as you can see here, that's positive. Okay? Now, why do I use this study as a prime example of how not to do this? Well, that's because if you go back to this picture here, what you see is that usage of certificates of possession is very highly correlated with proximity to urban centers. And so it's actually not very surprising that those bands who use CPs a lot are also the bands who are doing well. That doesn't mean, however, that the usage of CPs is causing them to do better. It could, for instance, be that you're close to an urban center, you're, the Musqueam Indian band, you're doing really well because you're close to an urban center. All the families in the band are looking forward to, prosperous future, and so they apply for certificates of possession because the homes they want to build them on their own land. So it could be that what we're seeing here, the connection between community well-being and community well-being and the CP usage is really what we call a spurious connection. There's no underlying causal relationship. It's really something else that's driving it. It's proximity to urban centers or higher levels of education, which are also correlated with more demand for individual land holdings and also correlated, of course, with higher prosperity. And so now, is this some kind of hypothesis of mine, or do I have a way to prove this? The answer is I do have a way to prove that the relationship is spurious by looking at this picture here. Now, what we see in this picture is a bit harder to read, but it's essentially the same thing. I just replicated the regressions of Tom Flanagan with my own data. What we see here is, again, the share of reserve land under CP on the horizontal axis. Every dot represents a band. On the vertical axis is economic well-being, the income measure of economic well-being. I first want to draw your attention to the upper part of the graph with the blue dots. There's the red regression line with a positive slope, which is the replication of the previous slide, saying that if you look at the raw data, there is a positive correlation between economic well-being and the usage of CPs. However, if you then go and control for all the variables that are affecting CP usage and are also affecting income, such as proximity to urban centers, geographic location, you can control for demographic variables, education, age structure, etc., and you become closer to comparing apples with apples. You can compare one band that's very similar in terms of its characteristics to another band which is also similar but has less usage of CP. And you can ask the question, well, now that I'm looking at really similar bands,
do bands that have a higher level of CP but are otherwise very, very similar, do they also have higher levels of prosperity? And the answer is no, they don't. And this is the second line that I've drawn here. These green dots are the residual, the part of the prosperity measure that is not captured, but all those other variables that I control for in the regression. So they're the residuals that are not captured by the proximity to an urban center, by the age structure, by the education structure of all those bands. And what the yellow regression line is saying is that the remaining, what's not explained by all these other variables, the remaining prosperity is actually negatively related to the usage of CPs. Okay? So in other words, once you control for those what we call confounding factors, the usage of the CPs is negatively related to economic prosperity. That doesn't mean, of course, that there is a causal negative relationship between economic prosperity and CPs. So it doesn't mean that, you know, if you, as a band, increase the area of land under lawful possession, you're going to decrease average income in the band. That's not what this means. What it means, though, is that we shouldn't trust these numbers. We shouldn't be doing this because we're not really, we can't really compare apples with apples here. Okay, so this is a prime study of how to not approach a question, because statistics is great, but you have to know how to do it. And if you don't, then you get particular results that could be very spurious and could lead to the wrong conclusion. Okay, so let me try to use the pointer again, and yeah, perfect. So this brings me now to the empirical findings that we have in our new study, and this is the sort of the last and third part of the talk. And what we're trying to do, not surprisingly here, is to get it right, or at least try to get it, make it sort of find an empirical approach that allows us to actually compare apples with apples, and then see whether the usage of CP, in fact, does improve economic outcomes on First Nations reserves. The way we're doing it is difficult, and this is now getting in a bit of a more complex statistical methods, so I need everybody to pay attention, and I apologize in advance, but there's really no way of getting around this problem without explaining what we're actually doing. So I'm going to have to. I want you to bear with me, and pay attention for another 5 minutes to see whether you're understanding what we're trying, how we're trying to approach the problem here. Okay. So what are we doing? Well, we're continue to look, just like in those previous slides and the previous sort of regression analysis I've shown you, we'll continue to look for structural regularities in the data that will allow us to identify the effect of an increase in the CP related measures of areas of like share of band land under CP and similar measures, and the outcome variable that we're interested in. We have two outcome variables for now. Actually, we have three. One set that relates to income, the other set relates to housing, and then we have a third set relating to population measures. The unit of analysis is still a band. But now we are looking at a band in year T. So in other words, we're now following bands over time. This allows us to not just compare band A to band B, band A being, you know, maybe the Okanagan Indian band that is doing really well, sitting in the booming Okanagan Valley and using a lot of CPs, and band B being some band close to Bella Coola that's very far up north and doesn't use any CPs, but rather because we're now observing a band, the same band over time, we can compare the band with itself at different points in time. Okay? That is called a panel analysis. And what the panel analysis allows us to do is to do this compare bands with themselves analysis, the sort of is to compare bands with themselves at different point in time. And what this does is eliminates the need to think about all those confounding factors that are time invariant, but that would otherwise influence the regression and lead to spurious results. And the reason it does that, and it sort of allows us to ignore all those factors, is the following. Once we look at the band across time, what we can do is we can think of all those variables that we are considering as as a flow over time. So there's going to be, for each variable that we have, the factors that go into the equation, which is the usage of CP, which is education attainment of the band members, which is the population of the band. So all those factors are going to influence the outcome variable. And for all the other factors that are all the outcome variables that are income and housing quality, all of those are going to move through time. And there's going to be a long-run average of those factors. So for each band, there'll be a long-run average of CP usage, there'll be a long-run average of household income, there'll be a long-run average of education attainment. What the analysis does is ask the following question. If a band deviated, for instance in terms of CP usage, from this long-run average at a particular point in time. So if there was a year where the band used more than their long-run average of CPs, was this year later associated with a subsequent increase in income relative, again, to the long-run average? So this is really comparing bands with themselves over time. And it allows us to completely absorb all the factors that are time invariant that would otherwise confound the analysis. I'm not sure I'm making sense here. I'm trying really hard. I get some nods, so that's great. So that's this is where the proof is in the pudding. The panel analysis allows us to, because we're now thinking about the deviations of bands from their long-run average, and we're asking, well, if you had a year where you were, where you used a lot of CPs relative to the long-run average, was that year later followed by more than average economic development, yes or no? Right? And because we're looking at the same band, the answer to that question will not be influenced on whether or not that band is at an urban center, because it always is close to an urban center. And so the long-run average will be reflecting that fact. It will have a long-run average household income that's higher than a band that's far up north, but the deviations shouldn't matter. For the deviations, this kind of effect doesn't matter. Okay? Yeah. Okay, so this is what we're doing, and and the question then that we can ask is it true that bands that have increased usage of CPs relative to their long-run average, are those bands experiencing subsequent increases do they see subsequent increases in average household income on reserve? And the answer is no, they don't. So this is a regression table, and for everybody who doesn't know how to read regression tables, I apologize, and I can tell you do not have to read it. Just listen to what I say, and I'll guide you through the most important numbers. I just put out the entire regression table for those who do know how to read it and want to see the statistics that are relevant. But most of these numbers you can safely ignore. Okay, so let's focus on this number here. On the left-hand side are the factor variables. Those are the variables that are influencing the outcome variable, which is at the top. So the average household income is what I'm measuring now at the band level in each year, that we have data for, which is 1991, 1996, 2001, and 2006. And then on here are the factors that are potentially influencing that variable. There's more factors, but I have omitted them for brevity. I'm focusing here really, the ones that I'm showing you is just the factors relating to land management. What this number here represents is the estimated coefficient. So this is the estimated effect in percentage terms of a change in this variable here onto the variable here. In other words, if I increase, so the way to read this number then is to say if I increase the area of a band, of a typical band, by 1 percentage point, I will have a 0.001 increase estimated of average income. That's what the model tells me, or that's what the data tells me, given the model, the way I've set it up. Is that a big number? The answer is no, it's not. It's tiny. This is a tiny, tiny number. What it says is that essentially, if you double your land under CP, that would be a 100% increase. The model would predict a 0.1% increase in average income. Moreover, the number is not just tiny, it is also not statistically significant, different from zero. So what we're seeing with this, you can see the statistical significance by looking at the number below, which is the standard error. The standard error in parentheses. As a rule of thumb, if the standard error is more than half as large as the estimated coefficient, then the coefficient is not statistically different from zero, which means that there is a more than 5% chance that the actual true parameter is zero. Okay. Now, ordinarily, this is the point where when you get these kind of results, you pack up and you say, well, that's terrible. I'm never going to get this published because lack of statistical significance is something that editors of scientific journals do not like. But in this particular case, what this tells us is that there is really not much of a measurable effect of this kind of individual land tenure on outcomes. Or put it differently, if there was an effect, this model would pick it up. But it doesn't pick it up. Now, in the second column, what you see is breaking up. What we did is we broke up this area under CP into different categories. Area that is under CP and individual lease, and then area that is under CP only, no individual lease, and then finally we added a third category, which is band lease. Band lease, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, is land that has been designated for economic development specifically by the band and is then leased out to third parties. And what you see here is that this is the only thing, this is the area that's under band lease that is actually showing up as being significantly different from zero and having an actual positive effect on average income, on reserves. Okay? So these stars, the more stars, the more confident we can be that the actual coefficient is not zero. That's an indicator of, that's a convention of statisticians to indicate significance. So every number that doesn't have stars attached to it is a number that we cannot really be confident that it's not zero. Okay, this is my, how am I doing time-wise? Okay, so I'm going to show you one more set of results and then I can wrap up. So you don't have to look at all those columns. I just want to highlight one column, which is, I think, this is the most important one. Again, what we're looking at here is an outcome variable. In this case, it's not income. It's the need for how the house, the probability, essentially the probability that the house is in major repairs. This is now the microcensus data. So we have individual data of all households, on reserve land. And in that microdata, we have an indicator for whether that particular household lives in a house that is in need of major repairs. And what you see here is that probability is decreasing in all measures of land tenure that we're looking at. And this is what you would expect, which makes me confident that the model is not completely crazy, and that because we're actually observing something that we expect to observe, which is, yes, if you do own your house, the probability that the house is in major repairs is actually lower. Right? And again, this is done using the panel regression analysis, so we're comparing households within the same band over time. So we're asking if you previously did not own your house and now you do own your house, same household, same band, do you, not same household, but same band, do you see if there's an increase in the area that is under CP, do you see a decreased likelihood associated with it 5-10 years later that the houses are in better shape? In worse shape? And the answer is yes, the likelihood that houses are in bad shape actually decreases. Okay? So housing quality does seem to be positively affected by the individual, both individual land tenure and, if you look at this number here, also is positively affected by band lease. The negative coefficient just means there's a decrease in the probability that the house needs major repairs. So the negative coefficient is good news in that sense. Okay. I'm going to spare you the rest of the table, and instead I'm going to try to summarize the findings of this of the research and give you a little bit of an outlook or a sort of a wrap up of what I think should be your take home the take home point here. So what we've seen here is that the evidence I presented points to a very limited uptake. Now, this was the first set of results saying that individual land tenure and reserve is a possibility. There is no reason in the Indian Act to, there is, I should put it differently, there is a provision in the Indian Act that allows bands to grant permanent title to land to their members, but that provision is not taken up in any significant way. The majority of the bands don't use CPs at all, and of those who do, the majority have less than 5% of that land under lawful possession. Okay. What we find in the regression analysis is that bands who do use CP do have a positive sort of experience, a positive effect on subsequent outcomes. However, that effect is very, very small, and it is not really, it's not statistically different from zero. So we do have this sort of caveat here that there's really nothing we're picking up. And if there was a strong underlying sort of causal relationship between individual land tenure and reserve and band level outcomes, we should be seeing this, but we're not seeing it. Right? That's the takeaway point here. And there is a positive effect, though, on housing quality. What you should keep in mind throughout all of this is that the CPs is not exactly the same what the First Nation Property Ownership Act would be proposing, which is individual private tenure in the form of C simple, which is, as I explained earlier, is not quite the same because the fee simple allows you to transfer your title to outsiders. And so there is this additional outside market that could potentially unlock more of the capital. However, given what I said about DeSoto, you should also think about the fact that there's really no or very little theoretical reason to expect First Nations bands to be very similar to squatters in urban centers in Peru or elsewhere. And so there's just the connection is weak at the very best. The evidence, as I said, suggests small, if any, gross benefit, but at the same time, people have pointed to a large number of potentially very large downside risks. I won't go into those because this is something that I don't have data about and I don't have actual evidence, but there are a lot of, people have pointed to quite a few risks associated with privatization of reserve land. And if you think about, if you want to get an idea about whether or not that's the First Nation Property Ownership Act is something you should be supporting or opposing, then weighing those risks that are potentially quite large against the potential benefits, which, if you believe my analysis, are rather small, should be something that you should take into consideration. Okay. So thank you very much for listening, and my apologies again for the early troubles with technology. I'm not used to these high-tech talks. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Kessler. And I guess we have time for a couple of quick questions. If anybody has questions they'd like to put to Anka.
Yeah.
You began by talking a lot about fee simple leases. I was just wondering why you didn't choose to study band leases, because you could lease out to third parties.
So we actually do look at band leases. The last set of results, we distinguish between individual CPs that have been leased out to third parties, and then band lands that have been designated and then leased out to third parties. And what we do see, if you remember the first table I showed you, is you do see a small but positive and statistically significant effect of band lease on average, of subsequent average income outcomes. Yes, in principle it is. So if I go back to that, sorry, I can maybe see whether technology is going to be favorable. So here, so this regression would allow you to compare the two. What you can see is that the same percentage, everything is in percentage terms, so it's in principle it's comparable. So a 1% increase in, or let's say 100%, let's say you double the area under band lease, that gives you on average a 0.5%, so half a percentage points increase in average band income. Okay? Whereas if you double the area of individual lease, that would give you, in the same regression, actually a small but insignificantly negative effect on band income. So controlling for the fact that these are also highly correlated measures, and now throwing them into the regression means I'm now controlling for the fact that some bands have a band lease, and that band lease will have this positive effect. And so this allows me to disentangle the composite effect of the CP. So in this case, the CP effect completely vanishes. Okay? So everything comes from the band lease. Nothing comes from the individual lease. Okay? Does it now answer your question? Yeah, okay. Any? Yes.
White tip. 12 minutes in Squest. Cookbee to Beltike to Swapik. Cookstem to Stolo, Squamish, Musqueam. Chief Michael Bordy was from Pines, the proponent of FinPo. When I saw this, I was really interested in what people have to say about what we're trying to do. And we're just trying to level the playing field. My father is in heaven. he had a little house, met my mom. He had a first wife, she left. And we had the Brady Bunch family, had a blended family. So he bought another house. So he owned 2 homes. And then we were moved by BC Hydro to Whispering Pines. And so he bought another house. All the time, through CPs, being owned by the Minister of Indian Affairs. The Minister of Indian Affairs didn't put a nickel into my house, my dad's houses. Anywhere else, as a Canadian, he would have been rich. He would have been able to send his kids to better educations, to better universities, to get better health care, and to move those lines up. But because every home on every Indian reserve but 3 houses in Nishka is owned by the Minister of Indian Affairs, that does not happen. It doesn't happen. It is not fair. I have a home on reserve. Does anybody here want to trade me? It's 5 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, got Wi-Fi. Huh? Any takers? I'll take a house off reserve, you can have mine on reserve. I didn't think so. Because buying a home on an Indian reserve in Canada, if you're an Indian, is the crappiest deal you can have. My sister wanted to buy, in 1995, she bought her home right beside my dad's. And I begged her, because I'm an ex-banker from Bank of Montreal, I begged her not to do it. I said, "Bye, don't do it. It's $95,000. You're flushing down the toilet." But she did it because she loved my dad. It's paid for. The stove's real good because she can't cook worth a damn, right? But we can probably get something for the stove. But the house is not worth anything. It's owned by the Minister of Indian Affairs, although my sister paid $95,000 for it. So all FinPo's trying to do is transfer the ownership from the Minister of Indian Affairs in Ottawa to the Chief and Council of Whispering Pines. And then Whispering Pines, Chief and Council, will give Viola her CP. Her husband is from Saskatchewan, an outsider. We need outsiders, otherwise we'll have a whole bunch of inbreeding. Oddly, we need outsiders, okay? And so that's okay. I have non-native ladies, non-native single mothers with band members who make mortgage payments and insurance payments for houses they don't own. That's not right. Why does the Minister of Indian Affairs get to own their house? They're paying the mortgage, they're paying the insurance. They're doing the right thing, raising their kids on reserve and doing everything right. And so this is what FinPo is all about. It's about leveling the playing field for First Nations, so that we can be up there with Canadians. The Dawes Act is totally different. That was the Dawes Act, the government owned the land. FinPo, it'll be the first. Whispering Pines First Nation will own the land. And then when an outsider comes and marries one of my 12 sisters, he pays the tax to Whispering Pines Indian Band, and that's how that's gonna work. And so that's how we're constructing it. And so I wanted to come here and see because I'm always, are we doing the right thing? Are we doing it okay? And so those are the kinds of things that I think about. And those are the kinds of things that I want to great discussion. Great to see you again, Bill. Cook's Jam.
Thank you very much for this contribution. If people have time, I would like to respond, perhaps a little bit longer to this, what has been just said. There are 2 issues here. One is that these are individual stories, and some of them are, of course, symptomatic for what's been happening on reserves. So I'm not saying that what your story is in any way an exception. But what the distinction between a CP and an actual land title fee simple ownership is the outside market, which I made very clear in the presentation, and which is what you're alluding to. If there was the outside market, then you could, sell the home for a lot more than what you could sell it within the band. I understand that, but I appreciate the fact that this can be cause a lot of hardship if you cannot sell the land to outsiders and then not have access to all that capital that's embedded in the house and in the land. But that doesn't invalidate what I just said, which is that the vast majority of bands most likely would not make usage of that new instrument. So even though it's a different form of ownership, fee simple is not the same as CP. It is very similar, and the fact that half of bands don't even use CP right now, they have no interest in CP, that nobody says, well, I really want this. There don't seem to be all these individual band members, and I really need that CP ownership because I want to at least be able to bequest the house to my son, or I would like to be able to sell it to other band members. That doesn't seem to be there, and it's highly correlated with where you are. If you're up north, the fee simple ownership is, as suggested by this analysis, is not going to do you much. Okay, now that brings me to the voluntary nature of the First Nation Property Ownership Act. I wasn't going to talk about it, but I think there is actually, I've been doing, in my career, a lot of research on governance as well, and also on electoral systems in general. One problem that I see with the voluntary nature of the First Nation property ownership. So for everybody else, voluntary nature means the bands will be able to opt into the act. So if they do not want to opt in, they can stay out and they can remain where they are. And this has been designed as a safeguard against the consequences that were there, that people would foresee from the Dawes Act. However, who is deciding whether to opt in or not? If it's the band council, then there is the issue of, is the band council the right body to decide whether or not the First Nation will benefit from the privatization of reserve and not? If it's not the band council, if it's, say, a referendum, then you would put a very crucial decision that will, for long-term, determine the fate of the band in the hands of a majority. And we all know we're living in a democratic country right now in Canada, and we all know that there's a lot of political decisions that are being made in this very country at this exact moment in time that are hurting a minority of people in Canada, and they're not even supported by a majority of people in Canada. So the fact that a decision is made democratically does not mean it's necessarily a good decision, a smart decision to make. Democratic means it's legitimate in a particular sense, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily the right decision. So that's my issue number one. And the second issue, which is related to that, is that research shows that people, especially when they're poor and when they're living in conditions of economic hardship, they tend to make extremely bad financial decisions. Financial literacy among the poor and among people that are badly educated, and this is what we're looking at here. We're looking at bands that have a huge percentage of people without high school diplomas, huge percentage of people below the poverty line. People like that tend to make very bad financial decisions. So if somebody comes along, you're not part of that, but other people are. If somebody comes along and says, well, I give you $50,000 for your piece of land, I want to develop it, for a mine or something, and I'm buying the entire land area of the band, every individual gets $50,000. it's going to be very hard. People have, maybe kids in college, they need the money. It's going to be very hard for people to make sound economic choices. And there's a lot of evidence that people tend to, in this kind of situation, completely overestimate the short-run benefits of the cash and underestimate the long-run loss of the land. Right? There have been titling, so in development economics, people have studied so-called titling programs, where people have gone into urban areas of squatters and have given out titles, individual property titles. What happens is the vast majority of people 2 years later they sold out, they cashed in on their title, and they're 2 years later they're right back where they started. Okay, so this doesn't mean that I don't want to take a stand on whether or not the initiative is good and what kind of implication it will have. What I'm trying to say is that there's good arguments to make in favor of being very cautious with it, because I see large downside risks, which may be the likelihood of them occurring may be very small, but if they do occur, they're large, and the current economic benefits I see, as measured by the analysis that we saw, are relatively small, and they go to a very selective number of bands. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your presentation, Anka. It was very enlightening. And thank you all for attending this evening's lecture. Please come again in 2 weeks' time when we'll have Dr. Rob McMahon talking about connectivity in First Nations and high-speed internet and all those sorts of things. So it'll be 2 weeks from tonight, same time and in this location. Thank you again for coming.